Hi there. Welcome to Developer Conversations, a series hosted by Recruiting Innovation, designed to bring developers to our recruiting community so that we have access to learn more about technology, about their work, and to have an avenue to ask questions of the developers in our community so that we become better educated technical recruiters. My name is Allison Daly. I am the founder and CEO of Recruiting Innovation, and I am your host for today's webinar and conversation. I couldn't be more excited about our guest today. David Liedle is currently a New York resident, but he is kind of a world traveler. He and I have met through our network, a good 6 to 9 months ago, and I've just been waiting for the right opportunity to carry on our conversation, and so I couldn't be more excited to have him as our host today. David is a programmer. He's been a programmer since he was 8 years old, so kind of a wizard, if you will. He's been a professional developer since 1998, and he's worked with companies of all sizes. He's given talks around the world on numerous technologies, and he joins us today from Colorado, where he is working as a developer relations professional for the company that he founded last year, developers.io. And he can be found online in most places under the name David Can Help, if you want to reach out to him. And he is going to be talking to us today about all things JavaScript. So libraries, frameworks, what the different things are, how they differ from each other. And then he's even going to walk us through what some of the big tech companies have chosen and why. So we are in for a real treat. I will say we are going to be saving some room at the end for all questions. So people that are in the event live, please use the chat button at the bottom. Put your questions in as they come up. We are going to save time at the end. So we'll just hold on to those questions, ask David at the end. And do consider this sort of also an open ask me anything for David. And he is a wealth of knowledge across all the stacks. But today he's just going to be talking about front end, but you can ask him on anything. So without further ado, David, welcome to Developer Conversations. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about today's topic.
Let me go ahead and give you the host powers and let you take it from here. Thanks so much.
Good. I'll share my desktop. And let me know if you can see my screen.
I sure can. Yes, this looks great.
Great. Let me just present. Okay, JS frameworks for recruiters. Now, as a recruiter, you don't necessarily need to understand the nitty-gritty details of the technology as you're helping to enable companies and talent to get together. It does really help to kind of understand the landscape. And in that same spirit, although we're talking about front-end JavaScript today, we're going to also kind of peek around the corner and get a feel for our surroundings in the world of JavaScript. What is JavaScript? It's a programming language. It's got a few places that it runs, but primarily people know it because it was invented to be used in the web browser in 1995. One of the most important things that you can understand as a recruiter is that JavaScript is not Java. I know that word is confusing. It's right there in the name. Why did they do that? Well, somebody thought it would be a good idea to name it something that sounded familiar to get everyone excited about it, kind of piggyback marketing. It was originally going to be called either Mocha or LiveScript, but it's too late now. That ship has sailed. Java was invented in 1991 by James Gosling, and it's an object-oriented programming language, and it's compiled. That means you write code, and then at the end of that process, you tell that code to shake down into something that the computer understands. Now, an interpreted language is not going to go through that compilation process. What's going to happen is, as you run the code, it's just like ticker tape flying through, and the browser's reading it as it goes. And that means that it can be a little bit slower than a compiled language, but over the years, JavaScript has been optimized to now it's extremely fast language. So anyone can read JavaScript. I mean, not necessarily understand it, but if you're curious about what the code is, unlike a compiled language where you open up a file that was spit out at the end of the programmer's work and see all gobbledygook, with a scripting language, you can open up the code and you can read it, and it looks kind of like English. Now, when you're in a browser, and I'm going to actually hit escape, and if you right click on any screen, well, not that part of it, but up here, and you go to view page source, you're going to be able to see all of the stuff that went into making the page that you're looking at. Now, this looks unreadable because it's been compressed. All the spacing has been taken out to save a little bit of room. But if I do Command F on a Mac or Control F on a PC, and I search for .js, there's a .js file right there, and that's a file that contains JavaScript. Now, that means that you can open it and you can read it. And to some extent, you can actually run it yourself and modify it. Now, because of that, and because the web was really riding on the wave of the open source movement, many of us that were first learning JavaScript, I think I first started with JavaScript in 1997. And much of what we would do is actually open someone else's page and read their code and see how did they do that. So it's a very transparent culture. The history behind JavaScript is one of sharing and one of openness. And of course, there are ways that you can hide things that are critical for your security. You're not, well, if you're doing it right, you're not putting your passwords and everything into your JavaScript code that gets pushed to the browsers. But the point that I'm making is that when a browser receives JavaScript along with the HTML and CSS, that is plain text that's being passed back and forth. Oh, and another point, JavaScript is the only language that has survived the battle for dominance on the web. There was a brief period where a language called VBScript, Visual Basic Script, made a brief appearance in Internet Explorer. That never really took off. I've actually written some VBScript code, and there's a reason it never took off. People aren't a huge fan of JavaScript when they really get down to understanding some of its logical flaws and quirks. However, this is the one ring to rule them all, if you will. Now, JavaScript has frameworks and libraries available to make the lives of developers such as myself easier. I started out writing everything from scratch, and if I was doing something over and over and over, I would save a little bit of code that was reusable, and I would take that same code and I would use it on my next project. Maybe in that project, I would make it grow a little bit more in functionality and scope and fix bugs, and then I would have that new version of that reusable code, and I could go back to a previous project and pop it in there, and that previous project would benefit from the changes that I had made to that little bit of reusable code. And what I was doing was I was making a library. That little bit of code was sort of an item that I could take with me from project to project, and it does a few of the repeatable tasks for me. People started to really, really get into creating libraries that would give us lots of superpowers. Things like trying to make it so that you could write a little bit of code and it would successfully run on all the browsers. So there was a really strong trend in the late 90s, early 2000s to look around at what the different libraries were and have philosophical arguments about, you know, should I use this one or should I use that one? That's only gotten worse with time. We get into outright open warfare, like completely arguing about this library, that library. And now we've got these frameworks as well. These frameworks are systems that are running. Think of an engine. When I turn the key in a car and the engine turns over, I can do a few things to that car. The point of the car itself is that someone else figured out all the things, how to make the wheels turn, how to make the engine turn over, and how to make the steering wheel actually direct the car in the way I want it to go. I'm entering into someone else's world. I'm stepping into their system, and I'm steering it and I'm guiding it. I expect certain things to be in that system, like security. I want my doors to lock, and I want there to be reliability. I want this thing to have enough range that I don't just crank the engine, get to the end of the driveway, and that's it. So when people create frameworks, they're actually making a larger system. A library is a little bit of reusable code, and I can bring that into my world. But whenever I'm using a framework, I'm actually stepping into someone else's world, and I'm bringing my customizations and my business logic and things into that world, and expecting my surroundings to be largely thought through and taken care of for me. So let's look at some popular frameworks and libraries. There are many, many more than what you see on the screen right now, but these are the ones that I felt we could cover today, and they may or may not be technically the most popular. I believe that the two most popular right now are Angular and React, and people will argue back and forth about why they believe one is or is not more popular, because it supports their argument that the one they like is better. And there are many different ways that we would measure that. One way that you could measure that is how many times has that been starred on GitHub, a place where the open source of these libraries and frameworks can be found. When a developer likes it, they might hit star, and then you could see, oh, this one has this many stars. Another measurement is how many issues are open on GitHub. People saying either a feature request, I'd like this to happen in this world, or a bug report saying like, oh, I found a problem. Now, if you've got a lot of bug reports, that can be a good sign. It doesn't necessarily mean that your project has more bugs than the other project. It means at least that there's more conversation around it, more attention, more people actively interested. So measuring how popular a framework is can be very tricky. You basically pick the numbers you like, and then you say, because of this, mine is the most popular. But really, I think that it behooves us all to look across the landscape at what is successful. And how would I define success? I don't mean a popularity contest. I mean, do these tools actually provide value to a developer and to a team of developers? And does that value translate into business value, or is it just fun for the developer? And then, we just spend all our time playing with cool toys, but never actually deliver features. Now, looking on the left side at frameworks, Angular 2 and all of the Anguli, if that's a word, all of the Angulars since then have been a framework. I kind of think of Angular 1 as a library because basically it was one JavaScript file that you would add to your page, and then it would bring all of these additional benefits, and you would then create more files. But that one file, importing Angular, was kind of the way that you brought that functionality in. And I can show you a little bit of why the modern versions of Angular are so very different from that. Express is a framework on the back end. And again, I said we were going to talk about front end today, but it's good to be aware of our surroundings. And so when you see Express, keep in mind that that is not something that's running in the browser. It's not targeting the client, the front end. It's actually on a server. And a server is just a computer that stays on most of the time, hopefully. And it's going to be a place that you would send a request. So your browser is going to say, hey, server, what do you have at davidcanhelp.me? And it says, oh, I've got this picture and this video and this CV and these bits of text. And that server pushes that out to you. And then your browser says, okay, thanks, I got it. And then you see a web page or an app. Ember is another back-end framework. And looking over at libraries, some of the first, there were two that really went head-to-head for a little while, MooTools and jQuery. And I've written thousands of lines of code in both, and I prefer MooTools, but it didn't win the popularity contest. jQuery just dominated. Jason Rezig, or Rezig, I want to say Rezig, was the creator of jQuery, that hence, I think, the J. But you might also think of that as the J for JavaScript. It was conveniently named. He was a brilliant programmer, and Microsoft came over and said, like, hey, we love jQuery, and they kind of wrapped their arms around it and made it a part of their thing. And I think that gave it an extra push into the market. And Angular 1 we've talked about. React is from Facebook. It's a library, and it only does a few things. Remember, a library is just a little bit of code that you bring into your world. And because of that, you need to reach out for other little bits of code to build a complete system. Similar to me handing you a steering wheel. Well, you can't drive that. You need to get the rest of the car and put it together. Vue is an interesting project that kind of takes the original ideas from Angular 1, because there was a huge shift when Angular 2 came out. They changed the way everything works. So I think some people really wanted to stick to that simplicity and the old way. And they've really made some improvements in Vue over the years. And it's a viable contender. Many people get frustrated with both Angular and React, and they reach for Vue. And then Svelte is a fascinating rising up-and-comer. It's something that true to its name, it feels very svelte when you're working with it. The philosophy there is to more embrace web standards, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But just seeing these names in front of you, getting enough exposure to be like, oh, okay, these are some of the pieces that we're talking about, some of the players in the market. So I just said a little while ago that JavaScript is the only programming language that's really survived for writing code in the browser, but there's a new way that we can write code. And what we do, we take a language that is not JavaScript, and there are various reasons that we choose to do this. But we take another language and we write code in that language. And then at the end of the process, you remember Java is compiled, right? You write code that humans can read, and then it crunches down to something a machine can read. Now, JavaScript is interpreted. So what we do in this process is we take another language like TypeScript and we transpile. We're not compiling it down to something that the computer can read. We're shifting it from one language and its keywords and syntax and structure into another language. So it's not compiling, it's transpiling. And TypeScript is something that Microsoft is putting out, and they're doing a lot of things that if you've been in the market for a few years, you might have had a strong stigma around Microsoft as a corporation and as a culture. I'll be gentle and say it that way. And let me just say, if you've been familiar with Microsoft for many years, take a look at what they're doing now. It's really becoming extremely popular, and B, they're doing it quote unquote the right way. Open source, embracing standards, and really some brilliant ideas coming out that people are embracing. TypeScript is becoming one of the leading ways that people are writing code for the web, even though it isn't JavaScript. But technically, it's a superset of JavaScript, which means if I run JavaScript through a TypeScript interpreter, as it listens to my instructions, it's going to be like, oh, okay, I get it. It understands JavaScript. What it's done is add certain valuable features into the JavaScript language that are not there. And then when it's all done, making use of that new power that it's given you, it will then transpile down to just pure JavaScript. And you can read about that at typescriptlang.org. Okay, so my top picks for 2020. I think that these are some of the technologies that people should be aware of. I've already mentioned a few of these, but on the front end, I think that Angular is going to continue to thrive. There are so many amazing things that are happening in the world of Angular. Don't ever let someone tell you that, like, oh, this library or framework is the new hotness, and so therefore none of the others are good anymore. We don't, as an industry, shift from one popular thing to another as a unit and flock between them over the years. You might observe a sort of statistical hint that we do, but technically what's happening is everyone that's invested their time to learn something, to build things, and to maintain those things over time, they have a vested interest in making sure that none of these technologies go away. So while I could come up with a new framework and I could call it, I don't know, I have coffee on my desk, but all the coffee words are taken, so I wouldn't name it something coffee. There's lamp, okay, but that's also a word that's taken. It's hard to pick words that aren't taken in the world of tech. Picture frame, okay, I've got a picture of my daughter here. So picture frame would be my framework, and I could tell the world and have great marketing behind it and everything, and it could catch your eye, and you could be like, oh, because I'm impressed by how excited this guy is about his framework, it must be like the next big thing that you're going to have to keep your eye on. But ultimately, what we want to look at in the market is, are there actual businesses invested already? Is there momentum? So that's a metric that I value. Not so much did a lot of people download this framework. Maybe all of them just downloaded it. I don't know. Maybe they're not using it. I look in the market as I talk to different businesses, and I see a lot of corporations are really embracing Angular. And even when choosing a new project, what do we start with? They will reach for Angular. The reason is that as a framework, there are certain rules. There's a certain way to do things. Remember, it's like an engine, a car that's already built, already running. you can, customize it and do a lot of things with it. But one of the powerful things about Angular is that it encourages good habits across large groups of people. Imagine if you have 100 different developers trying to collaborate on a project and you divide them up into teams. Well, if it's a healthy team, about 7 people. And so you've got all these teams, and different teams are working on different parts of the project. Angular has a really great design for that. So if you've got a large corporation, I won't name names, but I've been inside of many of the big financial corporations in New York, and as they show me what they're doing, I'm seeing Angular, 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 Angular. Now, React is, for whatever reason, and I'll be very, very candid with you, I don't like React. There, I've said it. I think it violates certain principles of development that I hold dear, and I don't like it, but I respect it. And I think that the most popular place that it's making a stand, if you will, as it argues for do things this way, is in the startup world. I think that as companies are looking at how do we quickly get to market, and another of my complaints, when you've got a large group of people, 100 developers, taking shortcuts can really come back around and bite you later. When you're a tiny team of 5 people, or you're just you and a co-founder, taking shortcuts is very tempting. And even though there may be philosophical reasons not to do that, there are practical reasons that you might choose to. So as people are getting excited about React, they're really branching out into, oh, how can we grow with this? And then they're bringing in more and more and more pieces to, build this conglomeration of libraries that serve essentially, at the end of the day, the same functionality that one might expect from a framework that already brings all of that included. Again, I have a personal opinion, but there are definitely pros and cons on both sides. Another, to criticize Angular, just to be fair, because it is a system that someone else built, when you step into that world, there's a lot of orientation. As you step in, you have to know, where do I put my backend requests? Where do I put my front end styles? Where do I put all the things, and make sure that I'm doing it properly? Because if I don't, I'm not really playing in that world the way I'm supposed to. Vue, I think, is something that companies are choosing in different ways for different things. Again, kind of to the same space as React, where startups would be very attracted to it. I'm seeing large corporations are reaching for it. It's lightweight, and that matters. If you've got a lot of functionality, chances are delivering that functionality to your users, to your client, is going to involve moving a lot of data. Because, we don't get to just write code and then magically it runs on your computer. First, I have to move that code from the server to your computer. And so if you've got a lightweight framework like a lightweight library like Vue, then you can get away with doing the functionality that you need, but not necessarily pushing a lot of information across. Now, to be fair, React and Angular are both constantly optimizing and making sure that they're reducing the amount of data that needs to move. So it's really interesting to watch as each one kind of struggles in that same journey to be stronger, better, faster, and smaller. And then Svelte is not yet washing across the entire planet and getting everyone super excited, but it should be. And I think you'll see that more. The main reason is that when people look at what it's doing, it's really tasty. For a developer, we're like, that is the right way to do this. So I have been looking for excuses to use Svelte in projects just because I want to spend time with it. It's that kind of a thing. And then something that probably very few people saw coming, Flutter. Now, Flutter may have come onto your radar as this new system for building mobile apps. But the cool thing about it is that you can build for both iOS and Android, and you just have one code base, and it magically creates apps for both of those two different systems. Now, they've added the ability for you to target other screens, and they've announced that basically, and this is Google creating Flutter, by the way, they've announced that they are using Dart, the programming language that Flutter uses, in production on their servers and everything. And they're really saying that Flutter is meant to target all the screens. So the screen in your car, the screen on your watch, the screen on your TV, the screen on your laptop, the screen on your iPad, every screen. And one of those targets is the web. And so I'll show you a little bit of that. In fact, now's a good time for that. Let me hit escape. Excuse me. One of the cool places that has appeared is on CodePen. CodePen is a place that front-end developers will very frequently create a little project. I can just create a pen here, and I can type HTML. I'll do H1. Hi, Allison. And then when I type that HTML, it actually shows over here on the right side. And if I do CSS, I could do body and then background color, gray. And I've just made a small change, but I didn't have to do any work to like put it out there. I can hit save and I can share that with everybody. And that's a very powerful place for people to try different front-end technologies. Down here in the JavaScript, if I hit that gear icon, I can bring in any library. See, here is React, there's Angular, there's Vue.js, there's Ember, there's jQuery. And all of these different things can be tried out and demonstrated and played with inside of CodePen. Now, here's the cool thing. CodePen has added Flutter. So if we try a template, we can see what someone else wrote to kind of get us started. There's a new design trend called neumorphic, and it's this sort of like awesome lighting, slightly raised, but part of its ground kind of a look. So let's create a new pen. They call each of those environments where we edit a pen. I'm going to create a new pen from a template. Over here on the left side, we see Dart code in the Flutter framework. So inside of this little area here is the code that makes this clock actually work. And that's not JavaScript. But when Flutter targets the web, what it's doing is the same thing that if we were writing in another framework or library, we are outputting ultimately at the end of the day, we're getting JavaScript, even though we wrote in a different language. Okay, what does Google use? Well, it's interesting because even though Google makes a lot of different technologies, their team has really been going for the Dart language. And I started working with Dart several years ago. It was towards the end of 2014 when I started playing with it. And then in 2015, I actually was able to try it out in a project. I was working for a Fortune 500 company, and we had a need to do some things that it felt like maybe Dart's a good choice there. At the time, we were using Angular 1. And remember, that was a library that you just pull in by adding some JavaScript, and you just bring in some extra functionality. And we saw the change coming to Angular 2. It was going to be a massive change. And we found out, look, that change is making Angular more like the Dart version of Angular. One of the things that's really cool is that Google has really committed to this. They're creating their money makers. You know, Google Ads advertising is where Google gets primarily their income. And Google Ads was being, the interface for the users and everything was being written in Angular Dart. And so that really got our attention. We were like, this is really worth checking out. And I'm really grateful that I was able to start playing with it that early, because over time it's led to opportunities that I never would have had. In this slide, and I'll make sure that we can distribute these slides if you're interested, or you can see this same video on my website, davidcanhelp.me. I was able to give a talk about Angular, and at the time it was version 6, and compare it and contrast it with Angular Dart at Google's office in New York City. And that was like one of the most fun talks I've ever given, besides this one right now. The timing of that was just amazing, because everyone was trying to figure out, what do we do with this language? People thought for a little while that Dart would replace JavaScript, that Google, who makes the Chrome browser, could just put their muscle behind it and say, okay, world, we're done with JavaScript. We're going to continue to support it, but you can also write in Dart. And that just kind of withered on the vine. Now we can choose a number of different technologies to write our code and then transpile that to JavaScript. And that's really the direction that that's taken, especially working with Flutter to target the web. So what does Facebook use? They're a large corporation. They've got a lot of power. They've got a lot of needs. And as they write tools for their own developers to meet those needs, they share them with the world. It's very kind of them. And most companies are aware of the value. When they do that, when they share their code with me, I'm able to use it and help be a part of the process of testing it because I'm using it. I see where there are bugs. I can go back and report those bugs. And then their team benefits because maybe I tried something that none of them ever have, and I'm doing something in a weird way and I messed something up, and it uncovers something in their code. And by using open source software that you share with the world, you're not just giving. A lot of people think, well, why would you give away your code? You're not giving away your code, you're sharing your code. And when we share, everyone benefits because all of us can make it better. And then we benefit from that larger group of people. Rather than hiring 1 million people around the world to work on their code, they get the benefit of 1 million people around the world using React. And that's a number I made up, by the way, but just, a big number. So as that happens, and as Google does that with Angular and everyone plays together, we find nicer and nicer ways to cooperate and get our machines to play nicely. So some criticisms. I told you I don't like React, and here's an interesting observation. Facebook likes to copy popular tech and alter it. There's a open source programming language called PHP. For many years, it operated at least 80% of the internet. And there was a time when Facebook said, you know what, we're just not happy with PHP. And they created HHVM. And their version of the PHP language, they named it Hack. So I was actually a huge fan of that. And I think that it pressured the people making PHP to add some of that functionality and those features into the actual language itself, because otherwise it looked like people might just leave the world of PHP and use this language called Hack, which we knew and loved because it already was PHP, but now we could go ahead and create things with these extra features. And NPM is a tool that we use to manage packages with JavaScript. They weren't happy with the way that was working, and so they created Yarn, which is a competitor to NPM. Many people still like using Yarn, even though many of the features that they were trying to add that were missing from NPM have since come into play. And then when it comes to a framework or library to build the front end, they just completely went another way. One of the patterns that I don't like in React is that inside of the JavaScript programming language, you will have chunks of actual HTML. And there's a principle of the separation of concerns in programming where we want to separate our design layer from our logic layer and separate those from our data layer. So people that think that way don't like seeing them cross-pollinating and mashed up together like that. But it's a shortcut that many people find valuable. And so if you can stomach it, you can really take it to extreme heights. So let's look at the future. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can see what is happening, and I can tell you that there are some things that are likely to continue, and some things that I wish that would, but perhaps are not going to do that well. Specifically, let's take a look at web components. And these are links. If you get a copy of these slides, click the link and you'll be able to actually see a little bit about each project. Well, not a little bit, as much as you could possibly want to learn about each project. So web components is basically a way that we can take chunks of functionality and bundle them up in a way that the browser can reuse and share, and it's a really good design, but it wasn't quite ready. Browsers did not yet have support back when people were really getting excited about it. So along comes this project called Polymer. This is also from Google, and there's also a Dart version of it. But Polymer allows you to use JavaScript to write web components, and that is something that not very many people are doing. That doesn't make it bad. It's just not, for whatever reason, popular. And I say popular, again, there's many ways to measure popularity, but you're going to find a lot more discussions in online forums, a lot more questions, a lot more activity in projects like React or Angular. and not as much around Polymer. Keep in mind that Angular offers a component system, so you might not feel the need to reach over and grab some of these other pieces. And that's one reason that people do not necessarily get excited about dozens of things simultaneously. We tend to find a little toolkit that works. If you've already got a screwdriver, you don't need a different color screwdriver. You can just use the one you've got. WebAssembly is something that is really, really amazing. So one of the problems that we talked about earlier about JavaScript is that it is an interpreted language. All of that human readable text is moving from the server to the client. And then when it gets there, it needs a JavaScript interpreter to actually process it and execute the instructions that are in there. WebAssembly is not just a place that we can compile our code to run. It is a place that we can compile our code way down to a very low level. Now, languages like C and C++ that are able to compile down to run on a native platform cannot be as fast as the assembly language that originally was used to create such things. Assembly language looks so weird. It's just these little short bits of text, and they have to be aligned in a certain way. And then you're basically using your knowledge of the Intel architecture or the AMD chip architecture, and you're almost physically, flipping little bits back and forth. And understanding the chip lets you manipulate it with assembly. Now, this is the level to which WebAssembly strives to go down to that level of optimization and efficiency, but it does so within a safe world, in a sandbox. And the good news is, unlike a lot of these other things that may or may not be supported or popular, WebAssembly is now in all the browsers. So it's something that a lot of people are excited about, because I don't have to write in JavaScript when I'm creating something that runs in WebAssembly. I'm still going to write JavaScript. It doesn't replace it. And in fact, I can't run my WASM or WebAssembly module without having a little bit of JavaScript wrapped around it to deliver it and make sure that it runs. But I can write optimized chunks of code. So if I'm doing a really intensive process like rendering graphics, or if I'm calculating a big number or something like that, if I wanted to calculate pi, for example, to a ridiculous length, I could write in a number of different programming languages that are able to target WebAssembly. And then when I export that, I still need to wrap it in a little bit of JavaScript to deliver this payload. And then it goes to your browser, and your browser, if you've got a modern browser, it's going to run, and it's going to run fast. Now, the languages that people are reaching for are languages that you would normally find very low level for writing for operating systems. So you can write in C, you can write in a new language called Rust. And that's a really powerful way to give developers alternatives to the JavaScript world, but also to give them the results of having this super optimized output. So another, whoops, I just lost my control of the screen. There we go. Another thing that's really important to watch is that browsers are adding features. So, we talk about all these things that we have to do. We start with a little bit of JavaScript, we make it reusable, we bring it from place to place and use it. But then all of a sudden the browser comes out with a feature, and now I don't even need some of these things. So front-end developers will use CSS to style their web pages. And now there are features available in the browser that let us replace some of the frameworks and libraries that we've used in that world. Every part of programming, you're going to find libraries and frameworks. So we've been talking about JavaScript. There are also libraries and frameworks, and even other languages that you can compile or transpile down to CSS over in the styling world with CSS. So as we see new features coming into the browser, that changes what's necessary. We no longer need this part of that library or this part of that framework, because now the browser does it and we can just go straight there. The example I have in mind right now is that we used to really reach out for CSS frameworks that would give us the ability to create a grid. And now there's an actual built-in CSS grid. So we don't have to, if we just need a grid, we don't have to import this heavy chunk of code that someone else wrote. We just use the built-in. So there's a website on the screen here, caniuse.com. If you're curious about support across the different browsers, you can go to that website and look at the feature. For example, you might check out web components on caniuse.com and see which browsers support web components. And that will really help you understand how many people would be able to view it if you were to release a product that had web components in it. What does the future of web development look like? Well, I find this very interesting, and it's kind of controversial number, but 98% of statistics are actually made up. I know that because I made this one up. And as you look at all of the predictions that people have in mind for what the future of development looks like, be careful to take it with a grain of salt. I think it's important for all of us to try each of the different technologies, or if you're a recruiter and you don't much care to learn technology, watch a YouTube video. Maybe someone gives a talk about an introduction to this or an overview of that, or moments like right now that we're sharing together, we're able to kind of just give you an orientation, an overview of what people have on their radar. And as you stay current with that, maybe as you're talking to a developer, ask them, we're looking for a React developer. What are your thoughts about that? Or we're looking for a Vue developer. What other technologies interest you? And as you kind of get to know the market a little bit and get to know individuals, I think that's a very valuable way to stay current and relevant as times change, because times really do change. I mean, here we are in the middle of COVID-19, and everything changes, technology changes, and it's hard to keep up. And we always must adapt. We always have to find what's next, and we don't necessarily have to gamble on what's next. We don't have to pick one thing and say, this is the winner. We can see the whole landscape and take it in as a whole. So my most informed, realistic view of the future looks like this. I know I just said we can't predict the future, but this is the trend that I already see. And like anyone in stocks or Bitcoin will tell you, past performance is not indicative of future results. So all of a sudden, maybe a huge security flaw will come out and we'll all realize, OMG, like we should not use this until it's fixed, and people might massively migrate away from a technology. So anything can happen, anything. But this is what I see, at least a continuation of what's already happening. I think, if you plot that on a chart, what each of these things are doing, I think people are going to start to really be talking and using these things, talking about and using these things more and more. I think on the front end, Flutter will rise on all screens. We're seeing that. They have a beta right now for the web platform target. And as soon as that's a built-in feature that ships with every release version of Flutter, I think a lot of people are going to realize, wow, I just made a mobile app and all I have to do is just click and it's a website. I think that's really something that's going to be taking off. I think React will remain in vogue. It's very popular. People are massively coming to it asking, like, how can I get started learning React? How can I do this and that? It's got a huge community. It's got the muscle of Facebook behind it to support it and keep it going. So I see that continuing to be strong. Angular will remain established in large teams and corporations. Again, it's so valuable to a large organization because it helps you to structure multiple people with different skill levels and experience levels and different areas of focus, and orchestrate large systems. So you're going to find that those Fortune 500s, when you get a contract to place staff in their teams, you're going to see Angular, 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 and that's going to continue for years. And I think that Vue and Svelte will both continue to grow. Transpilation will increase. Everyone's addicted to it now. Like, you won't find many projects that don't offer the option to write in TypeScript instead of being forced to only use JavaScript. So you're going to see a lot more of that. Remember, only JavaScript runs in the browser. But now we've got the ability for JavaScript to serve this assembly module. And so other languages are targeting that in WebAssembly. And then you're also seeing other languages that can be transpiled into JavaScript. So I see that really continuing as well. And those languages can be very different things. If you're interested, there's small talk from Alan Kay from the 1980s. It's a brilliant system that is available to run in the browser for the front end under a project called Amber.js. Go has a Go4.js or Go2.js, one of those, or maybe both. You can target the browser from Go. And what's happening is you're writing software in the Go programming language, and then pop out comes JavaScript. And even Lisp, there's a language called Clojure, which is amazing. It's an old Lisp variant. I mean, Clojure is not old, but Lisp is old. Lisp is from, I don't know, the 40s or 50s, and it stands for List Processing Language. If you've ever seen someone work in Emacs, this is Emacs over here. And this text editor, which by the way is way better than VI, another strong opinion of mine. It's basically a stack of different macros. That's the Mac part of Emacs. And it's a stack of macros written in the Lisp programming language. And it's got a lot of power. And standards, best practices, and native features will restore sanity. People try wild things different ways, and that's healthy and that's good. But when we all agree that we're going to do things in a certain logical, ordered way, for example, when all the browsers decide that they're going to support CSS grid, it makes everybody's life easier. I used to just pull my hair out. You kind of see that a little bit. There was a time when we had to write different code to support Internet Explorer 6. So if you went to a project and they said, you're going to have to support Internet Explorer, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth, and everyone would go out for heavy drinks after that meeting and be like, okay, we now have two projects. We have to build for everyone in the world, and then we have to build it again for the people that use Internet Explorer. Now, to their credit, Microsoft has slowly killed Internet Explorer, and it now is you find that they're pushing their new browser, Edge, and it runs on the same engine that Chrome runs on. In fact, it feels almost like you're using Chrome, but they've added a few cool features as well. So those standards and best practices are now across all browsers, and largely the browser wars have been won. And the people that won are us, the developers. We decided enough is enough, and the people that worked at these companies were like, okay, and we all got together and we said, we're going to standardize how we work, and that gives us a way to not even reach for a framework or a library. It just gives us a way to use the tools, the browsers, and just directly work with them. On the back end, I think that it will continue to be a varied landscape. There are many, many languages. You don't have to write in JavaScript for the back end. You can use Rust, C, Java, any language you can think of, really. And that will continue. I don't think there's a reason for it not to, because unlike the browser, which can only run JavaScript, a server can run whatever you install on it. I think that Node will be pressured in a new project called Dino. That's the D and the E from the end of Node and the N and the O from the beginning of Node, but they've been switched. The people that made Node, which is the JavaScript interpreter that runs on the server, they said, what if we did this a better way? And they flipped the letters and they came up with this Dino project. And I think that's really starting to take off. If you look at my Twitter feed, you'll see I retweet their announcements as they're approaching a release. They've got a release candidate of version 1.0, and that's something that will really be taking off as well. That lets you actually run code on the server in TypeScript. Remember, we used to use TypeScript to transpile to JavaScript, and then Node could run it, and then the browser could run it. But now we're actually finding ways to just run TypeScript, and Dino has a really good way to do that. I think on the back end, also Dart, Go, and Rust will find more footing. These are three languages that you will find are very popular. Dart was the fastest growing language of 2019, and the TOB index, I believe, was the one, or GitHub. One of them put out a report. It grew by 500% in their metrics. Again, 98% of statistics are made up. It's hard to know what is popular. What does growth mean? Does that mean there was one person and now there's five? I mean, percentages can be anything. So I do, from my perspective, believe Dart, Go, and Rust are going to continue to grow as well. Popular choices like Node, Java, and PHP will persist. Again, PHP for many years has been 80% of the internet. So anytime you hear someone criticize PHP, they probably have a good point. But at the same time, this is, oh, that's to the real world. Morpheus telling me, welcome to the real world. So we're going to wrap up here. We're going to also see trending towards safe, restrictive languages, and language features will increase. So when I say restrictive, I mean that we're basically tying our own hands on purpose so we don't do bad things. And that's something we can talk more about if you'd like to reach out. Now, I want to end with something my son says. He mispronounced when he was very little the words the end. And instead of saying the end, like at the end of reading a book, he would say be odd. Like that's just how he wanted to pronounce that. And I thought it's so cool because as you come to the end of something, to say be odd is kind of a clever sentiment. If you try to just do things the way that everyone else does and just chase the crowd and follow what's popular, you know, you're going to get Me Too results. But if you are someone that's willing to think outside the box, try new things, and be a little different, I think that can take us to exciting new places in life. So that's my talk. This is my contact info. And Allison, I'm going to attempt to return. I think you can take it back and we can do some questions. Let me check.
Yes, let's see. I think there's a way. I had it before, and now reclaim host. Got it. Excellent. Cool. Thank you so much, David. Oh my gosh, this was very, very thorough. I also love the future state scenario, kind of getting a feel for what's coming. If anyone here has questions related to the content, feel free to put that in the chat. I know I have a few questions. We're getting close to the 1 hour mark. So let me just maybe ask a few of the questions that I have. And if anyone else wants to put a question in the chat at the moment, please do. The whole libraries framework breakdown, I really liked how you were explaining how the framework is like an engine. It's pretty well established and you can do some things around it. I got a little bit confused about like the library compared like the bring your own code. So if I'm a developer and I have my own job, I can make my own little libraries that aren't necessarily even public, but they're just like Allison libraries. Is that correct? Right. And then, okay, when does something become more of like a public library?
Well, when you put something out for the world, you can do various things to make it feel a little bit more ready for consumption. A lot of people will publish their own private libraries and it's only them using it because it just never got popular. And then one day someone is, stumbling across your GitHub profile and they're like, oh, wow, I like the way this person does that. And then all of a sudden it turns into a thing. But usually what you would do if you want to make a public library is that you're going to try to contend with the competition, if you will. I know it's all free, so it's kind of a thing to make it a competitive place, not for dollars, but for mind share. So you want to get more people using your thing because when you do that, you've got influence and you've got connections and lots of value. So what you would do is usually try to do some documentation, explain to people how does this work, and you would create something called a README file. It's in a syntax called Markdown, and a lot of the hosts support org mode as well. And then that README is something that developers know to go straight to that and read what is the intention of this library or this framework and how can I get into it.
Awesome. Okay, and then I also really love the educational bit on transpiling and transpilation. That makes a lot of sense that it's actually like allowing you to write maybe a code that you prefer, but then it transpiles into JavaScript and then can work in the browser. I think, is that kind of a newer thing that's been happening, the transpilation?
It kind of is, and it started around, this is just off the top of my head, so it might be inaccurate, but around 2015, we started to see different bids for that to be, a way that we do things. There was a language called CoffeeScript. This is when Dart was actually thinking about targeting the web straight, not going through Flutter, but like straight to Dart. Ever since I think it's a philosophical movement that's made this popular, and that's that part about tying our hands so we don't do bad things. TypeScript, the value of it is that it lets you specify the type of your variable. So if I have a variable named name, you might expect that into that name variable, I would put my name, David. What if I put the number 42? Well, that's unexpected, and it could confuse and mess up the software that I've written. So if I can specify this name variable is of a type, it's of the type string, which is the way that we store text, then if the number 42 is there, it's going to say, whoa, hold on, you promised that was going to be a string, but it's a number. What's going on? And that catches us before we get too far down into the world of creating massive piles of bugs that we can't ever fix. It gives us value to restrict ourselves.
Okay. Another question. So you and I had talked about this back when we had our lunch, talking about Flutter, and I really liked how you were sharing that, you know, the history of JavaScript was like, it was like written in a couple days or something, and like there's a lot of issues with it, and some of the developers were like, hey, what can we do to like rebirth JavaScript, but then like with all well intentions and thoughts, and then Flutter was born. Can you talk a little bit just about that backstory? Because I think it's a great way to retain why this is such a unique library and why Google might be so excited about it.
Yeah, well, JavaScript has a lot of really cool things that it brings to the table, and I've learned a lot by working with JavaScript over the years. So even though we criticize the fact that it was kind of thrown together last minute and has a few logical inconsistencies and problems, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can watch a video, again from the top of my head, I think it's called WTF JavaScript. And this guy just goes down a list of things that are quite surprising, like adding 1.0 plus 3.0, you would expect it to be exactly 4.0, right? But it's actually 4.0000000000003 or something like that. And it's like, what's going on there? So, you know, the idea that you can work in a programming language that was designed on purpose, if you will, carefully thought through, looking at different programming languages and bringing them together. And JavaScript, to some extent, even in its baby form, was a brilliant combination of languages that came before it. Languages like Self that have prototypes and you know, different ways of thinking about problem solving. So I think that it's very valuable, and people should learn JavaScript. If you're watching this and you're like, oh, never mind JavaScript, no, you need that, and you need only the parts that are in Douglas Crockford's book, JavaScript, the good parts. So Google has brought to the table yet another way of doing things. And I think that the way that they've thought about this language, Dart, and this framework, Flutter, that it's the right way. It fits with the body of knowledge that we as developers, and remember, we've only been doing this since the late 40s as a kind of industry. Before that, of course, there's back to Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage and the original computers and stuff. But as an industry, we've really only been doing this for a short period of time, but building on that body of knowledge, what we've learned, what we've gotten right, and what we've gotten wrong over the years, I think Google's really brought that to a head with Flutter.
Well, and just how amazing that you can write one code and then send it to both iOS and Android and a car screen. It's just like amazing, because that's just, I mean, that's just fantastic. And it just saves a headache, and it means that small teams can do more with less. And it's just really cool to learn about that. You know, another couple new ones that I hadn't even heard of. So thank you so much, David. This has been incredibly valuable. I can't wait to share it for folks that are you know, watching now. We are going to be uploading this to the Recruiting Innovation YouTube channel. So you can see this again or share it with your team. I would like to thank our guest so very much, David, for hosting this and for taking the time to map out all this extra information. If you want to find David, you can find him at David Can Help. You have his contact details here on the screen. I'm your host, Allison Daly with Recruiting Innovation, and this has been our most latest developer conversation series. So thank you so much for your time, David, and thank you for everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.